Thank you, Richard. That is true. Back in the day, Richard Cowan did hire me, and that proved to be quite a fruitful relationship all these years later. Yeah, Alan was correct. A few months ago in Pacific Grove, Patients Out of Time put on a terrific conference as well, and Ann and I were panelists on a panel to talk about this issue. How the media reports our issue. You know, as a writer, I came into this issue thinking that Americans just didn't have the facts on marijuana. When they did, our issue would change dramatically. Well, I still don't think Americans have all the facts, but I'm not convinced now that even when we provide the facts, the mainstream media is ever going to pick up this gauntlet and actually report the whole story when it comes to the issue of marijuana. Why is this a big deal? Why should we care about how the media reports marijuana? Well, we ought to care because that's where most of the public gets their information from. And there is a whole lot of information, a lot of it being misinformation, but there's a whole lot of information out there. You know, studies are published every day about marijuana. The overwhelming majority of these never see the mainstream media. If you go to the National Library of Medicine, go to their website, you'll see that last year there were over 2,000 studies over the course of that year published about marijuana in scientific journals. This year, leading up to about mid-September, there are almost 1,100 separate studies published about marijuana. There could be media stories about marijuana written every single day in this country, but you'll be lucky if there's 6 or 7 mainstream marijuana stories covered in an entire year. I say here less than 5% of these studies are ever reported by the mainstream press. I'm being generous. It's probably about less than 1%. So on these rare occasions where the mainstream media does decide to cover our issue, what kind of stories do they tend to focus on? Well, that's easy. You know, of the studies covered by the mainstream press, most focus, not surprisingly, on the alleged dangers of cannabis. And here's some major headlines that I followed over the past 12 months or so to give you some idea what the media likes to cover when they talk about marijuana. We've got cannabis is bigger cancer risk than cigarettes. This is based on a New Zealand study that actually found the opposite, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. This story was everywhere. You could not avoid this study, not just in America, it went all over the world. The second headline, biggest study yet links cannabis to psychosis. This was a major story when it came out. Time magazine talked about it. We were doing media for weeks on this story. It's really sort of part of the mainstream thinking now. John Walters will not talk about marijuana without talking about psychosis. It's based on the way this study was reported. I'm going to talk about this study as well. Because in fact, it really didn't find that cannabis was a major risk for psychosis. Marijuana makes teeth fall out. It's so absurd, I'm not even going to talk about it. But the headline was everywhere. The Washington Post actually did 2 stories on this particular issue. And then the final headline, marijuana use may raise risk of heart attack and stroke. U.S. News and World Report. Once again, this was carried in basically every mainstream media newspaper. So, let's look at some headlines that really didn't go anywhere, that sort of fell down the memory hole. Health findings that do not support the alleged dangers of cannabis are typically ignored. Here we have some examples of those. Head and neck cancer not increased with marijuana. When this study came out, I found it was picked up in 16 media outlets, not just in America, but throughout the whole world. The irony about this particular study that no one's ever heard of was it was done by the exact same New Zealand team that is responsible for the headline that you saw on the previous page that said cannabis is a bigger cancer risk than tobacco. In fact, it included the same number of people. It was published 6 weeks later. One had 250 headlines. One study nobody's ever heard of, but people like Bruce and I. Second headline, whoa, the stuff in pot kills germs. Am I the only one that's shocked to see the journal Scientific American actually use that headline? Do you think when they're writing about other clinical issues they use that kind of lingo? I doubt it. You wouldn't even know what this headline's about, I'll tell you. It's a very important study. It was done in Italy, and the researchers there found out that 5 specific cannabinoids in marijuana, when they're administered topically to skin that is suffering from multi-drug resistant bacteria such as MRSA, cannabinoids are exceptional at staving the spread of that disease. And to put this in serious terms, more people die every year from MRSA in American hospitals than die of AIDS. This isn't funny. Yet Scientific American, one of the only about a dozen or so outlets that even thought this was worth covering, thought it was worth covering, but only if they could make a joke out of it. The final headline, since I see the screen has disappeared momentarily.
Hit the button. Hit your...
It's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Wait for it, wait for it.
Okay. Okay, the final point. Here we've got a whole list of studies. These are studies that were published in major journals going back to December. They all deal, as you can see, with the same subject. Compounds in marijuana can halt the spread of cancer. Not just one type of cancer, a whole number of types of cancers. Glioma, a very serious brain cancer, the kind that Ted Kennedy's suffering. You would think with a major U.S. senator being in the news, the media might have thought to pick up on some of these studies. You would think when we talk about things like the second to the last study below that found when you administer typical mainstream anti-cancer agents with cannabinoids, there's a synergistic effect. And it's more effective at killing cancer than just chemotherapy. That was reported in Sweden. You would have thought it would have been reported in this country. No. As you'll see at the bottom there, I found one headline in one paper in the UK that talked about one of these studies. This is just not reported on, because we're reporting on marijuana making your teeth fall out. So, when you have a mainstream media story about marijuana, what are the general themes? What are the consistent things that you see in story after story? Well, for starters, the news report must have an alarmist headline. And here we have some of those. Children as young as 10 on cannabis. Experts warn of a cannabis cancer epidemic. Smoking one joint equivalent to 20 cigarettes, study says. From Fox News, of course. Cannabis drove Brighton man to kill himself. I'm sure it must have just been the cannabis. Cannabis users risk their sanity. Really, it's people that work in cannabis law reform. We risk our sanity dealing with this stuff on a day-to-day basis. So when you get beyond the silly headline, what other components make up a typical mainstream media story about marijuana? Well, the news report must be written prior to the study's publication. And what that means is a journal is going to put out a study, but say they're going to put it out on Friday. They've embargoed it. Nobody can read the study until Friday, but the media wants to report on the study on Monday. So they write their story based on a press release. And then they call people like Bruce and I, and they say, will you comment on this study? And when we say, we'd love to, can you share the study with us? And they say, no, it's embargoed, we can't read it. So what happens is the news report is based on the press release that may or may not accurately reflect what the study says. And then when the study comes out, the news cycle has already run its course, and they're not going to go back and issue any corrections. This happens all the time. The news report must be highly selective in the data it chooses to publicize. Evidence or data emphasizing the harms of cannabis is highlighted. The data that fails to emphasize the harms is downplayed, even when they're in the same study. And thirdly, the news report must make no reference to previous published data or put the data in context. And really quickly, I'm going to try and run through 3 case studies of some of the egregious headlines I cited earlier. Biggest study yet links cannabis to psychosis. Here they say the widest yet investigation. Developing a psychotic illness increases by more than 40%. And by extrapolation, around 14% of cases of psychotic episodes